The Arizona sun, a bright eye in the vast blue sky, warmed Sarah's face as she worked. It was 1879, and her ranch, nestled among the dusty buttes, was her whole world. Every morning, she rose with the first hint of light, the scent of sagebrush and possibility filling the air. Her hands, though strong from years of hard work, still held a gentle touch, a memory of the love she'd shared with her late husband, Thomas. His presence lingered in the creak of the porch swing, the sturdy beams of the barn, and the quiet whinny of the horses. Sarah was a woman of grit and grace, her spirit as resilient as the desert flowers that bloomed after a rare rain. Life on the ranch was peaceful, a steady rhythm of chores and quiet reflection. She tended her small herd of cattle, mended fences, and kept a watchful eye on the distant horizon. Sometimes, as she sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and purple, her thoughts drifted to another time, another man. Not Thomas, but a stranger, a weary gunslinger she had found injured near her property a few years back. He had been close to death, his body battered, his eyes holding a haunted look. Sarah, with her kind heart, had taken him in, nursed him back to health with herbal remedies and warm broth. She remembered his quiet strength, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, and the deep gratitude in his voice when he finally rode away, promising to never forget her kindness. She hadn't expected to ever see him again. The desert swallowed people whole, and the life of a gunslinger was often short and lonely. Yet, a small part of her wondered where he was, if he was safe, if he ever thought of the quiet widow who had mended his broken body and, perhaps, his weary spirit. Her days were filled with the simple joys of ranch life. The lowing of the cows, the chirping of crickets at dusk, the feel of warm earth beneath her boots. It was a life she had built, a legacy from Thomas, and she protected it fiercely. She had faced hardships before, but always with a steadfast resolve. Sarah believed in honesty, in hard work, and in the quiet strength of a woman who knew her own mind. She had no idea that this quiet peace, this cherished existence, was about to be ripped away by a cruel hand, leaving her world in shambles and forcing her to confront a darkness she never imagined. The shadow of deceit was creeping closer, ready to shatter her serene world into 1,000 pieces. Sarah's peaceful life on the ranch, a haven of sun-drenched days and quiet evenings, was about to be shattered. The first sign of trouble arrived with the dust-covered wagon of Mr. Silas, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold eyes. He was a newcomer to the area, a land baron with a reputation for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. Sarah had heard whispers about him, tales of small ranchers losing their land, but she never imagined her own home would be in his sights. One sweltering afternoon, Mr. Silas, flanked by 2 burly men, rode up to Sarah's porch. His voice, smooth as polished stone, announced his purpose. "Mrs. Jenkins," he began, tipping his hat, though his eyes held no respect. "I'm afraid I have some rather unfortunate news. This ranch, your home, is no longer yours." Sarah felt a chill despite the heat. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady even as her heart began to pound. Mr. Silas produced a stack of papers, crisp and official-looking. "These are the deeds, Mrs. Jenkins. They show that your late husband, Thomas, sold this property to me shortly before his passing." Sarah gasped. "That's impossible. Thomas would never sell our ranch. This land was everything to him, to us." She reached for the papers, her hands trembling. As she looked at the signatures, a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The handwriting looked like Thomas's, but something felt wrong, subtly off. The dates, the official seals. It all seemed real, yet her gut screamed that it was a lie. "Forged," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "These are forged." Mr. Silas merely chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Forgery is a serious accusation, Mrs. Jenkins. Do you have proof?" He gestured to his men. "These gentlemen are here to ensure you vacate the premises. You have until sundown tomorrow." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Sundown tomorrow?" Her home, her animals, her entire life, taken from her in an instant by a cruel deception. She watched, helpless, as Mr. Silas and his men rode away, leaving her standing alone on her porch, the dust settling around her. The sun, once a comforting presence, now seemed to mock her, casting long, mournful shadows across the land that was no longer hers. Her heart felt truly broken, not just for the loss of the ranch, but for the betrayal, the idea that someone could so callously steal another's life. The quiet peace she had known was shattered, replaced by a crushing emptiness. She looked around at the familiar landscape, the adobe walls, the old oak tree, the distant mountains, and saw them through a haze of tears. Everything she had worked for, everything Thomas had built, was gone. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a searing pain in her chest, a broken heart in a world that suddenly seemed very cold and unfair. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks, but Sarah saw no beauty in it. Her heart was a heavy stone, sunk deep in her chest. She spent the night walking the perimeter of her ranch, touching the familiar wood of the fences, the rough bark of the trees. Every whisper of wind felt like a goodbye. By morning, her eyes were red and swollen, her spirit worn thin. She packed a small bag with essentials, the weight of her few possessions feeling heavier than any burden she had ever carried. With a final, tearful look at the home that was no longer hers, she started toward town, her head bowed, her future a blank, frightening page. The dusty main street of Redemption Gulch felt alien to her, a place of strangers. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Just as despair threatened to swallow her whole, a sound broke through her misery, the rhythmic thud of horse hooves. She looked up, her gaze hazy, to see a lone rider approaching. He was a tall man, his hat pulled low, his duster coat covered in the fine dust of the trail. He moved with a quiet grace, his hand resting lightly on the gun at his hip. As he drew closer, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was something familiar about his broad shoulders, the way he held his head, even the slight weary slump to his posture. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his movements fluid and practiced. As he turned, the morning sun caught his face, revealing a strong jawline, eyes that held a lifetime of stories, and a scar just above his left eyebrow. Sarah's heart leaped. It couldn't be. "Jake?" she whispered, the name of fragile hope. The man turned, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, his eyes, usually so guarded, widened in surprise, then softened with recognition. A slow, kind smile touched his lips, a smile she hadn't seen in years, but remembered like yesterday. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble, familiar and comforting. "It truly is you." He was thinner, perhaps, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, but it was him, the gunslinger she had found bleeding and broken, the man whose life she had saved. He looked tired, yes, but there was also a steady strength about him, a quiet power. Just when she felt most utterly lost, like a tumbleweed blown across the vast desert, he had reappeared. It was a miracle, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. A tiny seed of hope began to sprout in her broken heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't completely alone after all. Jake's calm presence was a balm to Sarah's raw nerves. He saw the tracks of tears on her dusty cheeks, the way her shoulders slumped, the deep sorrow etched into her face. The bright spar she used to carry was dimmed, almost extinguished. He remembered the vibrant woman who had tended his wounds, her hands gentle but firm, her eyes full of a quiet strength that had pulled him back from the brink. He owed her more than just his life. He owed her the peace she had given him during those long weeks of recovery. "What happened, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low and steady, pulling her away from the busy street into the shade of the general store's overhang. His gaze was intense, missing nothing. Sarah, usually so composed, felt the words spill out. The shock, the fake deeds, Mr. Silas's cold eyes, the eviction notice. She recounted the story, her voice wavering at times, her hands twisting in front of her. "He said Thomas sold him the ranch, she finished, her voice cracking. But Thomas would never. It was our home, Jake. Our life. Jake listened, his face grim, his jaw tight. He knew the type. Land grabbers, using lies and fear to steal from honest folk. He'd seen it before, but never had it touch someone he cared about so deeply. The image of Sarah, alone and heartbroken, stirred a deep anger within him. His weariness, the reason he'd ridden into Redemption Gulch for a spell of quiet, faded away, replaced by a fierce resolve. He took your ranch, Jake stated, not a question, but a cold, hard fact. With forged papers. Sarah nodded, a tear escaping and tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Jake reached out, his callous thumb gently wiping the tear away. The simple touch sent a jolt through Sarah, a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "You saved my life, Sarah," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, full of conviction. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost. I owe you a great debt." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the town, then back to her. "No one takes what's yours, not without a fight. Especially not from you." His voice hardened, a steely edge appearing that hinted at the gunslinger he truly was. "I'll help you get your ranch back, Sarah. I promise you that." His words were a lifeline in her sea of despair. A promise from Jake was as solid as the Arizona rock. For the first time since Mr. Silas's cruel announcement, a fragile hope bloomed in Sarah's chest. She looked at Jake, truly looked at him, and saw not just a weary gunslinger, but a loyal friend, a man of honor. And in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something more, a warmth that mirrored the faint stirring in her own heart. Jake's promise hung in the air, solid and comforting. He led Sarah to the small, clean room above the general store, the only place in town she could find refuge. As she settled in, Jake sat across from her, his presence filling the small space with a quiet strength. The urgency of her situation was clear, but for a moment, the world outside faded, replaced by the soft glow of the lamp and the shared memories that began to stir between them. "I remember that fever," Jake said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Thought I was a goner. You had me drinking foul-tasting teas and eating broth like a babe." Sarah smiled back, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in days. "It was the only way to get you back on your feet. You were stubborn, even then." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. Hard to argue with a woman who held a spoonful of medicine like it was a pistol. They talked for a long time, not just about the ranch, but about the days when she had nursed him. Sarah recalled the way his hand had instinctively reached for hers in the throes of a nightmare, the way his eyes, once so guarded, had slowly begun to trust her. She remembered the quiet mornings, sitting by his bedside, reading from an old book, the only sounds the rustle of pages and his steady breathing. She'd seen him at his most vulnerable, stripped of his tough exterior, and had found a gentle, honorable man beneath. Jake, in turn, remembered the soft touch of her hands as she changed his bandages, the calm strength in her voice as she spoke to him. He remembered the smell of her home, fresh bread, dried herbs, and something else, something warm and welcoming that he hadn't known since childhood. He'd watched her move about her ranch, tending to her chores with a quiet dignity, and had felt a peace he rarely found in his wandering life. He'd left her ranch a new man, not just healed in body, but with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying her kindness like a precious charm. As they spoke, the air between them thickened, not with tension, but with a tender familiarity. Old feelings, long dormant, began to stir like embers under ash. A slow-burn passion, born of shared vulnerability and quiet respect, started to flicker. It wasn't a fiery, sudden spark, but a deep, comforting warmth that promised something enduring. In that small room, surrounded by the shadows of the past and the uncertainty of the future, they found a connection that transcended words, a silent understanding that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reawaken. The ranch was still lost, but in Jake's presence, Sarah felt a different kind of home. The warmth of shared memories lingered, but the harsh reality of Sarah's lost ranch quickly brought Jake back to his purpose. His promise wasn't just words, it was a vow. He left Sarah resting and stepped out into the bustling town, his eyes now sharp, observant, looking for shadows where others saw only sunshine. Redemption Gulch was small, but every town had its secrets, and Jake knew how to coax them out. His first stop was the dusty county records office, a small building crammed with faded ledgers and stacks of paper. The clerk, a nervous man with spectacles perched on his nose, eyed Jake's gun belt with apprehension. Jake, however, spoke softly, asking about recent land sales, particularly those involving Mr. Silas. The clerk, intimidated but also a little relieved by Jake's polite demeanor, hesitantly pulled out the relevant books. Jake spent hours poring over the entries, his brow furrowed in concentration. He noticed a pattern. Several properties had changed hands to Mr. Silas in a remarkably short period, all with similar-looking signatures and quick turnovers. He also found Sarah's ranch listed, the deed looking suspiciously like the one Mr. Silas had shown her. The dates were odd, too, many just before or after the original owners had left town suddenly, or, in Thomas's case, passed away. Next, Jake visited the local saloon, a place where rumors flowed as freely as whiskey. He bought a drink for a grizzled old prospector, a man known for knowing everyone's business. With a few carefully chosen questions, Jake started to unravel the truth. The prospector, after a few more sips, began to grumble about Mr. Silas. That snake in the grass. Heard he got Old Man Peterson spread for a song. Then Peterson just up and vanished. Same with the Miller farm. Folks say Silas put the squeeze on him. Jake listened, piecing together the whispers. He learned that Mr. Silas had a knack for finding people in distress, those deep in debt, or widows suddenly alone, and then somehow their land deeds would end up in his hands, always with papers that seemed just a little too perfect, a little too convenient. People were scared of Silas, scared of his rough men, and no one dared to challenge him. He also spoke to a few other townsfolk, carefully, without giving too much away. A blacksmith mentioned how Silas had threatened him over a small debt. A shopkeeper spoke of Silas's bullying tactics. The picture became clearer. Mr. Silas wasn't just a clever businessman. He was a predator, using fear and forged documents to build his empire. Jake now had more than just Sarah's word. He had a growing pile of suspicious transactions and hushed tales of Mr. Silas's cruel deceptions. He knew where to start looking for the proof that would truly expose the land baron. His inquiries had not gone unnoticed. Mr. Silas, a man with ears everywhere, quickly learned of the new gunslinger asking questions about his land deals. He saw Jake as a threat, a fly in his carefully spun web of deceit. Silas preferred to work in the shadows, but when someone dared to shine a light, he sent his muscle. One evening, as Jake walked Sarah back to her room above the general store, two hulking figures stepped out from the alleyway, blocking their path. They were Silas's men, their faces hard, their hands hovering near their pistols. "Heard you've been poking around, stranger," one of them grunted, his voice low and menacing. "Mr. Silas don't like folks poking." Jake remained calm, his gaze steady. He moved slightly, placing himself between Sarah and the men. "Just asking questions," he replied, his voice even, betraying no fear. "Nothing wrong with a little curiosity." The second man scoffed. "Curiosity can get a man hurt. Maybe you should ride out of town before you find yourself in a heap of trouble." His hand twitched toward his gun. Sarah felt a surge of fear, but she saw the unwavering resolve in Jake's stance. He was a wall, solid and unmoving. He knew these games, had played them countless times in dusty towns across the territories. He knew how to read the glint in a man's eye, the tension in his shoulders, the precise moment when words turned into action. "Trouble usually finds me," Jake said, a hint of steel in his tone, "and I usually know how to send it packing." His right hand, almost imperceptibly, shifted closer to his own weapon. It was a silent, deadly language understood by men like these. The two thugs exchanged a glance. They saw the quiet confidence in Jake's eyes, the way he carried himself. This wasn't some greenhorn. This was a man who knew how to handle himself. They knew Mr. Silas would be angry if they failed, but a live body was better than a dead one. Consider this a friendly warning, the first man said, his bravado wavering slightly. Next time, it won't be so friendly. With that, they stepped aside, melting back into the shadows of the alley. Jake watched them go, his hands still ready, until they were out of sight. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jake, that was dangerous. He looked at her, his expression softening. It's part of the game, Sarah. Silas is trying to scare us off. But he doesn't know me, and he certainly doesn't know what I owe you. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Don't you worry. I know how to handle trouble, and I'll make sure nothing happens to you. His words were a shield, a promise of protection, and Sarah felt a profound sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. The brief, tense encounter with Silas's men only solidified Jake's resolve, and it deepened Sarah's trust in him. With the danger clear, they knew they had to be careful, but also swift. They spent the next few days working together, poring over the information Jake had gathered. Sarah, with her sharp mind and knowledge of local land, helped Jake connect the dots, pointing out discrepancies in the forged deeds and remembering conversations Thomas had had about his property lines. They ate meals together, shared coffee in the quiet mornings before the town awoke, and talked late into the evenings. These weren't just talks about strategy. They were conversations that peeled back layers, revealing the people they truly were. Sarah spoke of her hopes for the ranch, her quiet dreams, and the simple joy she found in growing things. She shared stories of Thomas, not with sadness, but with a loving warmth that Jake admired. Jake, in turn, spoke of his travels, the vastness of the land, and the solitary nature of his life. He didn't boast of his gun skills, but spoke of the difficult choices he'd had to make, the constant fight for what was right in a world that often favored the crooked. He found himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone, feelings he'd kept locked away for years. Her steady gaze and gentle understanding made it easy to open up. As they spent more time together, their friendship, already forged in a moment of life-or-death kindness, grew stronger, deeper. Sarah saw past the gunslinger's reputation to the honorable man beneath, the one who protected the innocent and sought justice. Jake saw beyond the grieving widow to the strong, intelligent woman with a resilient spirit and a heart full of compassion. A quiet affection began to bloom between them, slow and gentle like the desert wildflowers after a long drought. It wasn't a loud, sudden passion, but a deep, comforting warmth that grew from shared respect and understanding. A knowing glance, a soft touch of hands across a table, a lingering moment in the doorway. These small gestures spoke volumes. They were two solitary souls, each carrying their own burdens, finding solace and a growing sense of belonging in the other's presence. The threat of Mr. Silas still loomed, but within their shared space, a different kind of future began to softly, beautifully take root. Their quiet days of planning and talking had borne fruit. Sarah, remembering a hiding spot Thomas had used for important papers, found a small, hidden strongbox beneath a loose floorboard in the old barn at the ranch. Inside, among other family heirlooms, were the original, undisputed deeds to the Jenkins Ranch, clearly dated and signed years before Thomas's passing. The true papers, undeniable proof against Silas's lies. The moment Sarah held them, a wave of defiant joy swept through her. Jake took the real deeds, his grip firm. Now, they had the weapon. The time for whispers and investigations was over. It was time for a confrontation. He found Mr. Silas in his grand, newly built office on the edge of town, a lavish room filled with expensive furniture and a large, polished desk. Silas sat behind it, a smirk on his face as he counted coins from a leather pouch. His two toughs stood by the door alert. Jake strode in, his presence immediately stilling the room. Silas looked up, his smirk fading as he recognized Jake. Well, the meddling gunslinger returns, he sneered, his voice laced with venom. Thought my men made it clear you weren't welcome. Jake ignored the taunt. He walked to the desk and calmly placed the original deeds to Sarah's ranch on the polished wood. The papers, though worn, lay in stark contrast to the fraudulent one Silas kept. "These," Jake said, his voice low and steady, "are the real papers for the Jenkins Ranch, signed and sealed long before your lies began." He pushed them closer to Silas. "You know what these are? And you know they prove your deeds are forged." Silas's face went pale, a flicker of panic in his cold eyes. He quickly recovered, forcing a sneer. "What is this nonsense? Those are old scraps. My deeds are legal and proper." He glanced at his men, a silent command passing between them. They both moved, hands dropping to their holsters. Jake didn't flinch. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, met Silas's. "You've cheated people for too long, Silas. You stole Sarah's home, her peace, and you won't get away with it." His right hand, a blur of motion, rested on the handle of his own gun, but he didn't draw it. The message, however, was clear. He was ready. "I'm not here for a fight, Silas," Jake continued, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "I'm here for justice. You will give the ranch back to Sarah. You will sign the rightful papers. Now." The air crackled with tension. Silas stared at the true deeds, then at Jake, then at his men, who looked less eager to challenge this stoic gunslinger. The cold, hard proof, combined with Jake's unyielding presence, had him trapped. The tension in Mr. Silas's office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Silas's eyes darted between Jake's steady gaze and the real deeds on his desk. He knew he was caught, but a man like Silas, cornered, often lashes out. "You think you can just waltz in here and tell me what to do, gunslinger?" Silas snarled, his voice rising. "My men will deal with you." At his signal, the two toughs by the door drew their pistols, their movements quick but not quite fast enough. Jake was already moving. He didn't draw his own gun to shoot, but to disarm. With a lightning-fast motion, Jake's hand swept across the desk, sending the inkwell flying. It shattered against the wall with a loud splat, spraying black liquid across Silas's expensive wallpaper. The distraction was brief, but it was all Jake needed. As the toughs flinched, Jake spun, his left hand a blur as it knocked the first man's gun upwards, sending a shot harmlessly into the ceiling. Before the man could recover, Jake's right hand delivered a sharp, open-handed strike to his jaw, sending him stumbling backward dazed. The second tough, surprised, tried to get a beat on Jake, but Jake was already on him. He ducked under a wild swing, his elbow coming up sharply to connect with the man's arm, making him drop his pistol with a clang. A swift kick to the knee brought the man down with a grunt. It was over in seconds. Two of Silas's enforcers sprawled on the floor, stunned but not seriously hurt. Jake stood amidst the chaos, his breathing even, his eyes still fixed on Silas. He hadn't fired a single shot to injure, only to control. His aim wasn't to kill, but to show undeniable power, to bring justice without unnecessary bloodshed. Silas, wide-eyed, stared at his incapacitated men, then back at Jake, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. The gunslinger hadn't even broken a sweat. This wasn't just a tough man. This was a force of nature. "Now, Silas," Jake said, his voice calm, but with an edge that promised swift consequences for further defiance. "We were discussing those papers. The real ones." He gestured to the deeds on the desk. "You'll sign them back to Sarah, and you'll sign a confession to your business practices." Silas knew he was beaten. His men were down. The proof was undeniable, and the man before him was clearly capable of much more. He slumped back in his chair, all his bluster gone, replaced by a defeated fury. The fight for what was right had been quick, decisive, and had left no doubt about who held the upper hand. With his men defeated and the true deeds staring him in the face, Mr. Silas had no choice but to concede. Under Jake's watchful eye, Silas scrawled his name on the documents, returning the ranch to Sarah. He also, with a bitter scowl, signed a statement confessing to his fraudulent land practices, a document Jake insisted upon to ensure justice for others Silas had wronged. Jake then calmly walked out of the office, the signed papers in his hand, and found Sheriff Brody waiting outside. The sound of the commotion, the single gunshot into the ceiling, had drawn attention. Sarah stood anxiously nearby, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Sheriff," Jake said, handing him the stack of papers. "I believe Mr. Silas has a confession to make and some deeds to rectify." Sheriff Brody, a fair but slow-moving man, looked at the documents, then at the pale, defeated Silas now emerging from his office, his henchmen still groaning on the floor. The evidence was clear, undeniable. The sheriff had heard the rumors about Silas, but without concrete proof or someone brave enough to stand up, his hands had been tied. Now, with Jake's swift action and the signed confession, the truth was out for everyone to see. "Mr. Silas," Sheriff Brody announced, his voice firm, "you're under arrest for fraud and unlawful land acquisition." He motioned to his deputies, who quickly moved to cuff Silas, his face a mask of furious humiliation. A wave of murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Cheers erupted from some of the townsfolk who had also been wronged by Silas. Justice, long overdue, had finally arrived in Redemption Gulch. Sarah watched as Silas was led away, a profound sense of relief washing over her. The heavy burden she had carried for days lifted, replaced by a lightness she hadn't dared to hope for. She looked at Jake, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You did it, Jake," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He offered a small, tired smile. "We did it, Sarah." Later that day, with the legalities confirmed, Sarah stood before the county clerk, the official papers in her hand, her name once again rightfully attached to her ranch. The simple act of reclaiming what was hers felt like a victory far greater than any battle. Her home, her legacy, was safe. The quiet peace, once shattered, was slowly beginning to mend. With the ranch officially back in her name, Sarah finally felt like she could breathe again. The weight of worry had lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. That evening, as the Arizona sky began its daily transformation into a canvas of fiery oranges and deep purples, Sarah and Jake stood together on the porch of a ranch house. The air was cool, carrying the scent of desert blooms, and the vast silence of the land enveloped them. Sarah leaned against the porch post, a soft smile on her face as she watched the sun dip below the distant mountains. "It feels like coming home," she murmured, her voice filled with a quiet joy. A true home, not just a place. Jake stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the same horizon. He had planned to ride on once justice was served, to continue his solitary wandering. But standing here, with Sarah, the thought of leaving felt wrong, incomplete. The peace he felt in her presence was deeper than any he'd found on the open road. "It is home," he agreed, his voice gentle. He turned to her, his eyes, once so weary, now held a warmth that matched the sunset. "And it feels like it always should have been." Their hands, almost without thinking, found each other, fingers intertwining. It was a simple touch, yet it spoke volumes of the journey they had shared, the dangers they had faced, and the quiet love that had blossomed between them. It wasn't just gratitude or friendship. It was a deep, abiding affection, a slow-burn passion that had steadily grown from the embers of their past connection. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the sun. "What will you do now, Jake?" she asked, a hint of unspoken hope in her voice. He squeezed her hand. I think my wandering days might be over, Sarah, if you'll have me." He looked out at the ranch, at the fields, at the sturdy house, and then back at her, his expression earnest. "This place, this life with you, it feels like the future I never knew I was looking for." A tear, this time of pure happiness, traced a path down Sarah's cheek. She nodded, her heart swelling with a joy that felt both new and eternally familiar. They had found more than just justice for her ranch. They had found a shared future, a new beginning. As the last sliver of sun vanished, casting them in soft twilight, they knew their journey together had just truly begun, a life built on loyalty, redemption, and a love as vast and enduring as the Arizona sky.